Hello everyone, my name is Ziyah Johnston and I'm a senior at Westfield State University. I completed this project from the fall of 2022 to May of 2023 in collaboration with Dr. Michael Filas, who served as my main advisor. I also had the help of Dr. Elizabeth Starr and Dr. Brian Jennings, who were also part of my project committee. My project analyzes Stephen King's novel, It, through the lens of dissociative amnesia to see how the effects of realistic and fantastical horror come together to instill trauma upon the main protagonists. By analyzing their traumatic childhood experiences in Derry, I have illuminated the realistic horror in relation to the dissociative amnesia in this novel. While the character of Pennywise, a shape-shifting killer clown, seems to receive all the credit for the horror in this novel, the realistic horror, such as bullying and parental abuse, plays heavily into the amnesia experienced by these characters in their adulthoods and is just as important and horrifying as Pennywise, a fantastical horror. I tried to pick an aspect of this widely read novel that not a lot of other critics were discussing, which is where my interest in dissociative amnesia came from. This phenomenon adds to the degree of horror in which the main protagonists experience, and I feel like this aspect of the novel needs to be deeply examined in order to understand the kinds of horror presented in this novel. The amnesia experience shows just how severe and traumatic the childhood experiences of these characters were, and helps readers understand the nature of horror of everyday life and how it affects people in the long term. It was originally published in 1986, and since then, 3 film adaptations have been made with different actors depicting Pennywise, the main villain of the story. My project focuses on Bill, Beverly, and Ben, but the rest of the main protagonists are Mike, Eddie, Stanley, and Richie, who are all nicknamed the Losers Club. They grow up in the 1950s in Derry, Maine, and all experience the hauntings of Pennywise, a shape-shifting clown. The story follows the main protagonists through not only their childhood in Derry, but also their return to Derry as adults in the 1980s. Pennywise returns to Derry every 27 years, so after the Losers Club defeat Pennywise for the first time as children in 1957, they all leave Derry with the exception of Mike Hanlon, who stays, and when Pennywise returns to Derry in 1985, Mike calls all his childhood friends back to help him defeat Pennywise again, who has returned and started killing residents of Derry like he did 27 years prior. All the main protagonists return to Derry, except for Stanley, who commits suicide upon receiving the call from Mike, as he could not withstand the thought of facing Pennywise again. In the end, they all defeat Pennywise as adults for good. After the Losers Club defeat Pennywise as children, they all move away from Derry, except for Mike. All the losers who moved away forget all the happenings of their childhood in Derry, while Mike is the only one who remembers because he never left. It must be understood that the fantastical horror brought upon by Pennywise is not the only kind of horror experienced and then later forgotten by the losers. All of them were bullied as children. Beverly was abused by her father, Bill's younger brother was actually murdered by Pennywise, and the list goes on. There is a great deal of realistic horror that they experience as children, and this too goes forgotten, and it is all remembered only when Mike calls them back to Derry. The phone call acts as a trigger for the process of remembering their past, and as they travel back to Derry, the memories become more and more clear, which is very overwhelming for them, but necessary if they want to defeat Pennywise once and for all. The phenomenon of the losers forgetting and then remembering their suppressed past is called dissociative amnesia. Because these memories are forgotten due to emotional, mental, and physical trauma experienced, this amnesia implies. According to the Mayo Clinic, dissociative disorders are mental disorders that involve experiencing a disconnection and lack of continuity between thoughts, memories, surroundings, actions, and identity. Some symptoms of this amnesia include memory loss of certain time periods, events, people, and personal information, significant stress or problems in your relationships, and suicidal thoughts and behaviors. Beverly experiences significant stress with her husband as he abuses her, and also Stanley suffers from suicidal thoughts and actions. All of them exhibit the main symptom of extraordinary memory loss, but each character also has specific aspects of their adult lives who are affected by this amnesia as well. This section now explores dissociative amnesia in Bill, Beverly, and Ben specifically. During Bill Denborough's childhood, he had a severe stuttering problem, which he was bullied for by Derry's resident bully, Henry Bowers. Besides this, Bill goes through the worst trauma out of anyone in the Losers Club. Bill's younger brother, George, was murdered by Pennywise. Note this is something that seems to be the very definition of unforgettable, but this memory of George being murdered also gets forgotten once Bill moves away. When Bill grows up, he becomes an author and ironically writes horror novels. Critic Lauren Christie writes, we make up horror to help us cope with the real ones. The dream of horror is in itself an outletting. It may well be that the mass media dream of horror can sometimes become a nationwide analyst's couch. It is like Bill subconsciously becomes an author in the horror genre because a good part of his childhood was literally something out of a horror novel. Even though Bill does not remember the horrors of his past, it comes out in his writing whether he is aware of it or not. After Mike calls Bill back to Derry, Bill starts to tell his wife Audra that he needs to leave immediately, and she starts to inquire why. As Bill is trying to explain to Audra what happened to him as a child, he is just starting to realize how much he forgot. When the memories of his dead little brother begin to resurface, he says, "What I'm trying to tell you, Audra, is that I haven't even thought of George in 20 years or more." As Bill travels to Derry, he can almost feel Derry rushing at him. 18 miles a minute or not, the sensation is of being perfectly still, while Derry rushes at him like some big carnivore which has lain in wait for a long time and has finally broken cover, end quote. As seen here, Bill has forgotten the most traumatic experience of his life, and as he gets closer and closer to the place where it happened, he feels like it is going to swallow him whole as his memories are so overwhelming. Beverly's childhood was filled with emotional, mental, and physical abuse at the hands of her father. The only escape she had was her friends, aka the Losers Club, where she felt protected and truly loved. When Beverly becomes an adult, she gets married to Tom Rogan, who also severely abuses her. While Beverly does not remember her childhood abuse, she subconsciously ends up in a household with a man again who treats her like her father did. Leonard J. Hildreth says, "The past must be permanently escaped, even the past self must be escaped. If the future is to achieve realization and the individual is to create, through experience, a new self." Before Beverly leaves Tom, she is still living in her past life, even though she doesn't realize it. Only when Beverly leaves Tom for good does she truly escape her abusive past. Often in the novel, Pennywise, referred to as it, and Beverly's father Al are talked about in the same way. For example, Beverly, quote, "suddenly understood that she was alone in the apartment with it, alone with it on this doozy August morning. It had been diluted somehow by her father's essential humanity, but it was here working through him," end quote. Beverly's father is so evil to her that she equivocates the hauntings she receives from Pennywise to her father's abusive tendencies. It is like she can only understand the reason behind her father's abuse if it was at the hands of Pennywise. When it comes to her husband Tom, she left him when Mike called her back to Derry, but not without a fistfight. As Beverly defeats Tom, nearly beating him to death, she thinks, quote, "He'll live." The new Beverly, the Beverly who seemed to have surfaced at Mike Hanlon's phone call, replied coldly, "Guys like him always live. You just get the hell out of there before he decides he wants to tango again," end quote. Beverly seems to have a transformation post-phone call from Mike. Seeing her friends again, the same friend she lost all memory of before, has given her the motivation she needed to leave her abusive husband. Beverly's friends are the only safe haven she had as a child and now again as an adult. Ben was an overweight child and as a result was severely bullied for it by Henry Bowers and Henry's friends. Henry even went as far as carving his initials into Ben's stomach at one point. Not only is he bullied for his weight, his mother overfeeds him, and if Ben does not eat the amount she wants, she guilt trips him to eat more. Ben grows up to become a famous architect, and after he gets a call from Mike, he heads to a local bar, and the bartender, Ricky Lee, instantly notices something was very wrong with Ben. Ben Hanscom looked at Ricky Lee out of eyes that suddenly looked 10, no 20 years older than the rest of his face, and Ricky Lee was astonished to observe that Mr. Hanscom's hair was gray. He had never noticed any gray in his hair before. Hanscom smiled. The smile was ghastly, horrible. It was like watching a corpse smile, end quote. After some time, Ben asked Ricky Lee, quote, "Did you ever hear, Ricky Lee, of having an amnesia so complete you didn't even know you had amnesia? I remember Derry, but only because that was where he was calling from," end quote. Notice how Ben outright admits that Mike was the only link he had back to Derry. Without this phone call, he would have continued to forget everything that happened in his childhood. It is also worth noting that the losers only defeat Pennywise once and for all as adults, but not as children. The adults going through the process of not only remembering trauma, but also coping and accepting what happened to them is a process only adults can really handle. Erin Mercer touches on this point when she says, "Certainly the novel is concerned with childhood imagination, but it is also concerned with the coming of late of horrors of history that are both personal and communal, horrors that only adults can begin to understand," end quote. Not only did the main protagonists of it forget Pennywise, the main villain of the novel, they also forget all the realistic horror that took form as loss of family, abuse, and bullying. Even without Pennywise, these characters go through really awful childhoods that were only emphasized by the hauntings of Pennywise, who preyed on their worst fears. A lot of these fears stem from the realistic day-to-day horrors that they were going through. Pennywise and real-world issues are not a competition here. Rather, Pennywise uses the protagonist's realistic trauma to turn them into tangible fears that they can see in the form of, say, a clown or some other figure that he can shapeshift into. The two kinds of horror go hand in hand in order to create the ultimate traumatic childhood. Each member of the Losers Club experiences bullying as children. Quote, about 20% of students ages 12 to 18 experience bullying nationwide. More specifically, being overweight or obese is one of the most common reasons that children and adolescents are teased or bullied at school, end quote. In addition to this, the CDC states, quote, at least 1 in 7 children have experienced child abuse or neglect in the past year in the United States. In 2020, 1,750 children died of abuse and neglect in the United States, end quote. These kinds of realistic horrors, unfortunately, are highly relatable to many in our real world. This is another reason why this realistic horror is so terrifying. Being bullied or abused is a lot more likely to happen to someone than being haunted by a supernatural clown, but both contribute to what makes this book so traumatic for the characters and what causes them to suppress what happened to them. The realistic horror in this novel is the kind of negative experience readers can relate to at times. Mix this with a clown, another fear for many people, and you have the concoction for a really scary horror story, not just for audiences, but for the protagonists as well. The two-sided trauma in this novel seems like no matter what, it cannot be forgotten if you actually lived it. But by knowing the psychology of dissociative amnesia and having the phone call from Mike to trigger the memories, they came flooding back at a rapid pace and forced our characters to deal with this unresolved trauma. While seemingly unwelcomed and scary at first, revisiting these memories in the town they took place in not only helped them to defeat Pennywise once and for all, it also helped them heal from their past and learn to move on from the trauma that was haunting them subconsciously. Thank you for watching.